All right, so now I am pleased to introduce you all to our speaker for tonight. So we have Dr. Lauren Adamo. She is the director of the Geology Museum, and she is also a professor over in the Earth and Planetary Science Department that we were talking about earlier. We were showing you all about our repository, and we told you a lot about the department. So without further ado, go ahead, Lauren.
Thank you, Ria, and thank you, Ashlyn, for doing the trivia with everybody. Hold on one second. Let me get thank you. Okay, so welcome everybody. It's nice being on the presenter side. Usually I'm the one introducing the speakers. So thank you for joining us for Geologic Core Night. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about an introduction to cores and different types of cores and a little bit of what you can learn from cores, but fully acknowledging that this is just a very small sampling of what cores can tell you and about cores. There's a whole lot more, so I don't have enough time in one night to go on and on. We teach whole classes here about interpreting cores. So we won't be able to cover everything, but hopefully I'll give you a good idea. Okay. Sorry. So I went too fast. About me. As Ria said, I'm the director of the Geology Museum. One of my favorite stones is what you see in this picture here. They're called Petoskey Stones. They're the state stone of Michigan. What they are is they are fossilized coral that has been formed into rounded pebbles. And I just think they're really cool looking and pretty. I have a couple on my desk over here. And I have one that my dad gave me when I was little, which I keep on my desk, which I love. I just think they're really pretty. I also always wanted to be a paleontologist when I was little. This is something that I drew or wrote when I was in like first or second grade. When you talk about what you want to be when you grow up, I wanted to be a mom, I wanted to drive a car, and I wanted to be a paleontologist. And this is not made up. I actually wrote this when I was little. My parents have confirmed that. I'm pretty sure I had to ask the teacher how to spell paleontologist though when I wrote it. So I'm pretty lucky that I get to study paleontology. I don't dig up dinosaur bones like I was envisioning when I was 6 or 7 when I wrote this, but I do use fossils in the form of foraminiferas, which you learned about in the trivia. Okay, so what is a core? So a core is a sample. It's usually a cylinder-shaped substance. So they are obtained by either drilling or where you push a sampler through something, and then the center of that sampler is filled with either sediment or rock or trees or ice or things like that. And this picture you see here is me. I am loading the multi-core device that you can see on the top of the ship. So you can see there are these tubes all around. There's about 8 of them around this thing that goes down to the bottom of the ocean. And you can see this one doesn't get super long cores, maybe only, 30 inches, maybe a meter, not very far. So this type of coring only takes like the very top part of the ocean floor. All right, there we go. Okay, I can't tell if I'm hitting one or twice, so I apologize if I go back and forth. So let's talk about the different types of cores that you can take. So first one, I'll talk about our tree rings. And again, this was also mentioned in the trivia. And you can see pictures here of a bunch of different tree rings, sample cores that were taken in various locations. And again, you can see the different layers of the core of the tree. So each ring being 1 year. And so scientists will study the thickness and they'll study the different chemicals and things like that in those rings in order to tell things about the past. A lot of times people will ask me, do they have to cut the tree down to sample it? And the answer is no. So this method of taking cores. They take a very, very thin thing and they basically drill it into the side of a tree, and then they pull it out, and you can see it looks like pencils, like Rhea mentioned earlier in the trivia. So they can also do this to trees that have been, that have died and that are buried in the sediment. They will take samples of it to get cores as well. But they do this on trees that are living today to get records. Another type of core, which is one that I'm familiar with because this is what I work with, are sediment and rock cores. These two pictures over here are ones I took. So this is actually basalt, which is a type of igneous rock that was collected from the ocean floor. So this is like part of the mid-ocean ridge. And then this core right here is actually like one of the cores that I worked on for my PhD and what Rhea works on for her master's that she's working on right now. These are sediment cores from the North Atlantic Ocean. You can see they're a bunch of mud, and then these little holes that you see in this pink thing, this is a piece of foam that's put in place to hold the mud and keep the mud from kind of filling in the gap, because those are places where samples were taken. And then this sample is a really short core that's just taken the top layer of sediment, and you can see it's actually collected the water that's at the surface right above the core as well. Okay, and another type, which I have not had the opportunity to go and collect ice cores, but it is one of my geologic dreams to get to Greenland or Antarctica to be involved in an ice coring expedition. But these are ice cores that were collected from various locations in either the Arctic or the Antarctic area. So you can see here's a core that has come up from below the surface. In this case, you can see these people are collecting ice cores by hand. So they're using like an auger or something to drill into the ice. And so these would be shorter cores that they will collect. And then here is a storage facility. So in order to work with cores, you have to keep them frozen, because if you don't keep the ice cores frozen, you just have a bunch of water and you've lost all of your data and all those layers that and all that good information that's preserved in those cores. So I have had the pleasure of being able to work a little bit in ice core labs. And you can see, here's me in the ice core lab, and you can see the other people behind me and see how bundled up everybody is. And this is because it's, below zero in the lab, and you have to bundle up like you were going out for a winter storm because it gets very, very cold. And you work in that condition to cut the cores and sample the cores, because again, you don't want water, you want to keep it as ice. And then here's a close-up picture of a piece of those ice cores. And what you can see here, all those little like marks in there, those are air bubbles. So those are actual samples of what the atmosphere was like when that ice was deposited. So these are like little time machines into the past that scientists like to take the air that's trapped in those air bubbles and analyze them, and that helps tell them things about climate. So another really exciting type of core, we actually have cores from the moon. And so these were cores that were collected during the Apollo missions. And Rutgers is very lucky that we have Dr. Juliana Gross, she's a professor here at Rutgers, but she's on leave to NASA right now because she is the deputy director of the Apollo samples in NASA. So she's at NASA in Houston right now, and she's actually working with a team of other scientists dissecting these Apollo cores. So these are actual pictures taken on the surface of the moon. You can see there's the footprints, and this is the core that was collected. So Apollo 17 73002, that's the name of the core that she's working on. Let's see, come on, go to the next slide. Oh, did it go? Okay, so here's Dr. Gross, here's Yuli, where she's carrying the core. That they work in clean rooms because they don't want to contaminate this core at all. And this core has never been exposed to the atmosphere on Earth because they don't want it to be contaminated with the atmosphere. It is kept under a nitrogen atmosphere so that it keeps it pristine. And the reason why they're working on this now, when these cores were collected 50 years ago, is that when they collected them, they knew that in the future technology was going to change and they would have much better ways of analyzing these cores, you know, a couple decades in the future. So here we are 50 years later, and we have much, much better tools in order to analyze these. So this picture here on the side, this black and white picture, these are X-rays. And so this is an X-ray of the core that was taken in the 70s, and this is an X-ray that was taken in 2019. So just with that improvement in X-ray technology, you can see there's a huge difference in what they're able to see. So just imagine how much more information we can get from these cores today due to better technology. Okay, so here's a picture of the core team that is working on extracting this core, and it's amazing that it is 3 female scientists doing this work. You can see they're very excited to extract the core. So if you look, so this is that nitrogen atmosphere area that they work under. So in order to work on this, they don't touch the core with anything that's touched the air. So they have to stick their hands in with the gloves, and they have to manipulate the core that way. And then the core is actually right here. Okay, you can see it on this platform in front of you. Okay, so this is another picture that Dr. Gross sent me about how they are dissecting it. So the core is a tube, okay, and so how they're dissecting it is these things where it says pass 1, 2, 3. These are different plates on the side of the core, and so they are actually removing those one at a time. And then they remove past 1, and then they take a little tiny scooper and with those gloves, and they pick it up and they put it onto a sample thing. So they do this for the entire length of the core. I think she said there's like 37 intervals that they're sampling, and they're like really small intervals of like a ½ centimeter or so. I don't remember the exact dimension, but they go piece like a little spoonful, not even, sort of like the back side of a toothbrush. That's how big the little scooper is that they send in. They go in, they scoop a little part out, they put it on a tray, and then that gets taken off and labeled so that they can sample it. And they do this over and over again for pass 1, 2, and 3. So this not only gives them a downpour look of how it's changed, but it's also looking how it changes laterally in the core. So it's a lot of work and a lot of time of playing, you know, with not playing, but almost like playing, sticking your hands in the gloves and scooping tiny bits of dirt from the moon out so that they can be analyzed later. Okay, is it going? I don't know why my computer screen is so slow today. Okay. All right, so this is another activity that you can do later if you want to simulate how cores are made. You can scan this QR code here. It will take you to a site from University of so Dartmouth College and their School of Ice, which is a professional development that has a lot of activities on specifically ice cores and how to utilize ice core science in your classroom. So definitely check it out if you're a teacher and interested in that. So what these are cores that made by people like me. This is actually my core that I made right in the center when I did this workshop to illustrate how cores are made. Okay, so where this is a tube and we put stuff inside of it to represent different events in our life. So what exactly does that mean, and how does that relate to cores? Okay, so this is another activity that you can do with students if you're a teacher to simulate how a core is made. Okay, so here we have our core in the center, and we have all these emojis around it. And we know today that we use emojis as a way to represent something in your life. Okay, so if you were going to school, you might use the school emoji. If you took your dog for a walk, you might use this emoji. If you had coffee in the morning, you might use this emoji. So they're used as an approximation of some event that occurred in the past. Okay, so if I wanted to build the story of what happened during my day, right, I might do something like this, where I put coffee at the bottom because that's the first event that happened. I put it in the core first. Okay, so then I ate breakfast and I went to school. Maybe this is for like a little kid, might have art class, and then came home and played video games. So that is your story that is represented by these things in the core, okay, by these little approximations that we're using emojis to represent. So how does this relate to actual geology? Okay, well, the first thing is that it relates to one of these principles of stratigraphy. So stratigraphy is the study of the layers of rock. And so people who are stratigraphers look at different clues in the rocks and through time to kind of figure out what's happening over time. So this principle of superposition is a way that helps geologists figure out the order of events, okay? So superposition states that sedimentary layers are deposited in a time sequence. So this means that the oldest layer is always going to be on the bottom and the youngest layer is on top, okay? So this is like here. Our oldest layer, or the event that happened first, is put at the bottom of the core. So that is represented in our emoji core with the coffee emoji, okay? So then the youngest event, and anyone who's listening can type this in the chat, what would be the youngest event in my emoji core? Does anyone have an idea? Someone want to type in which event from our emoji core, if this is the oldest event, which is the youngest event? I have someone saying video games. Yes, the video games. More people saying video games. Yes, that would be the youngest event because it's the event on top, okay? So yes, the oldest events are on the bottom of cores and the youngest events are at the top of the core. So whatever happened most recently. So that is one way that geologists use to interpret layers of rocks or cores, that we know that what's at the bottom is older than what is at the top. Okay, so this is another type of life core model that I have made with students and kids at the museum before. We have this tubing, and then inside I give them little Shopkins, which if you have kids, you probably know what Shopkins are, but they're like these little itty bitty toys that, you know, they're different household items. So they're like different food and a hairbrush and, you know, all kinds of different clothing and stuff. So they do the same thing where they build the story of their day with representations of those events through these Shopkins. So these figures represent an approximation of an event that has happened in past. And the reason why I keep using the word approximation is because it's related to the word proxy. So you might have heard this before, climate proxies or a proxy that's in a core. So a proxy is, you know, something that's a representation or substitute for. So when we study the past or paleoclimatology, which is what a lot of core science is done, is that we look at what is in the core. So the physical characteristics that are in the core. So this can be, you know, things like chemical signatures, or it could be a physical characteristic of like how many of something is there, or what is there and what's not there, what fossils are there, etc. You measure that, and that gives you an idea or an approximation of what happened in the past. So it's not the actual event. So when you look at the little emojis, so the coffee thing, okay, that's not the actual coffee that you drank. We know that, but it's a representation of that, okay? So why do we care about proxies? Well, scientists go through lots of different cores and lots of different locations, lots of different proxies, looking at all different things, which I'll go over what some of those proxies are, to put together things like this record right here. So what this record is, it looks like a lot of wiggles to most of you, which you're right, it is. But let me just explain the different parts of the graph. So down here, this is time, okay? And so this is today. So this would be 2020 here. Oops, sorry. And then this would be about 2,000 years ago. So it's going back to 2,000 years ago. And then this axis is in degrees C. So then these lines, which I'll show you what they are, these are what the different proxies that we find in the record. So this could be things, information from tree rings. It could be information from foraminifera, which we talked about in the trivia. It could be information on, you know, how many tree rings, how many ice layers, things like that. Tell us about what the climate was doing. So it's not just climate that this is used for, but it is a big thing of what cores are used for, is to understand climate. And that's where what my research is to look at the climate record. So I'm not going to go through all this, but this is just to show you that that one record, oh geez, sorry, this one record is the work of lots and lots of different people. These are all the papers that were put together to make that record. So that is a lot of work, a lot of people, a lot of different proxies, a lot of different cores to put together that record. Okay, so let's go with like a more specific example. So if we look at ice cores, okay, Ria already talked to you about the different layers in the ice cores, okay? So we know that during 1 year, we get one light and dark layer, which represents 1 year in an ice core, okay? So if you can go back and count how many ice layers there are and look at the different proxies that are in the ice, you can tell something about climate. So here's a closer up picture of an ice core. So what do you notice in this core that you might, if you're a scientist, what would you want to analyze in this core? So what do you see here that you might have made in our craft tonight? Someone type in the chat. So someone said, yes, this black line. Yeah, that is very prominent in this thing. And yes, Jez, you are absolutely correct. This is a layer of volcanic ash. So that is something that you would find in an ice core. So this is a proxy for a volcanic eruption that occurred in the past. What do people see? What do you see in this part here that maybe you made with the sugar and the salt? See, season changes, yes, okay. Season changes based on the different layers. So we see the dark and the light layers there. So yes, we definitely see the black line, which I've already told you is ash. We have the different layers. If you look, you can see there's dark and there's light layers. Those represent the season changes from winter to summer. But there's other stuff in this core that will give us information. So let's talk about what things can be preserved in that core. So first thing is gases, okay? There is gas preserved in those ice cores. Remember, I showed you those ice bubbles that were in the cores, okay? Scientists can take those ice bubbles, they melt the ice, and they collect the gas that comes out of it, and they put it through a machine that analyzes what type of gas is there, and it can tell them information about the past. This is the main reason we know how CO2 has changed over the last several 100,000 years. When you ask, well, how do we know what the CO2 concentration was 100,000 years ago? Well, that's because scientists analyzed the air bubbles in an ice core, and it told them what the CO2 concentration was. So just to be clear, the gas that's trapped in the ice cores, that is the only thing that is not a proxy, okay? That is an actual direct measurement of the atmosphere because it is an actual sample of the atmosphere. All the other stuff that I'm going to go through, those are proxies, approximation of what the conditions were in the past, okay? But gas and the CO2, that is a direct measurement of the atmosphere in the past. Okay, so some other examples of gases that you can analyze from ice cores. things like methane, CO2, oxygen, nitrogen, argon. There's a whole bunch of different gases that are trapped in those itty bitty ice bubbles. Another thing that can be trapped in the ice core is dust. So that can give us idea of weather patterns. So there are big dust storms that come off of Africa and deserts, and that dust gets travels very far, even to the poles. So that can give you ideas of the weather. Pollen. So pollen, which, makes us all miserable in the spring, but that pollen can be blown very far distances and it can get trapped in the ice. So scientists will go and they'll look at the pollen, the exact type of pollen that is in those in the ice cores, and they can tell how the vegetation has changed through time. And there are, as we know today, there are plants that live in warmer weathers and there are plants that live in colder weathers. And if you can look how that pollen number is changing through time, it gives you an idea of the climate. Okay, so it's not the actual climate. We can't tell exactly how cold it was based on the type of pollen, but we can tell, okay, this is a colder time period because it has this type of pollen, and those are more cold weather plants versus more temperate weather plants. Okay, volcanic ash, like that big dark layer, those are great for telling us ages because we can use things like chronologically date. We can actually get a date on the volcanic ash to tell us exactly how old that is. There's very few things in cores that we can actually, find out, the half-life and determine how old something is. So you've probably heard of carbon-14 dating. And yes, we can carbon-14 date items, but that is only good to things that are 50,000 years or younger. If you have volcanic ash or an igneous rock preserved in cores, then you can date things that are much, much older, up to, millions and billions of years old. So it's, scientists like when there's volcanic ash because they can get a date on that layer. Okay, stable oxygen isotopes. So you can do all sorts of isotopic analysis using a mass spectrometer. And there's whole courses here at Rutgers just on isotope stratigraphy of how we can use isotopes, things like oxygen and carbon and nitrogen and all those to tell how things have changed in the past. So that can tell us about, when there was more ice, when there was bigger glaciers, when it was warmer, things like that. So put it all together. All right, this is more squiggles, but what it tells us is how the CO2 has changed over time. So this is years before present. So this is today, and this is 800,000 years ago. And you can see this is the CO2 record where it's going up and down, and back and forth. Okay, so there is this variation, and that is from directly sampling the gas that's trapped in those air bubbles. And then here we have temperature. Is it, where it's warmer, colder, etc. And that would be interpreted from those proxies, things like the different stable isotopes. And so this is one way we can put information together of how the climate has changed in the past. And then if we have things like sulfate concentrations or so sulfates, I didn't put it on the previous slide, but this is another thing that you can find in ice cores. And that is an indicator for volcanic eruptions. So you can see when you see a spike, okay, where it goes up, this is when there's a volcanic eruption. So not only will the sulfate concentrations tell us if there was a volcanic eruption, but it can tell us the magnitude of the eruption. So these really bigger spikes, this is when there was a really big eruption. And then when there's smaller spikes, this can tell us it's a smaller eruption. So if you know these ones, Tambora and Krakatoa, these appear to be smaller spikes on here. That does not necessarily mean that these spikes were larger. It can also indicate how close to the core location the volcano was. So ideally, you would look at an ice core from the northern and some southern hemisphere and try to find the same peaks. And if they're, both very large, or if it's bigger in the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere, that tells you that it might have been closer to the northern hemisphere. So there's a lot of information of not just, oh, it's cold, it's warm. You can also find a lot of useful information about past eruptions. Other things that geologists use cores for, they use it to interpret how plate tectonics has changed over time, where, how the movement of continents has changed over time, how the age of the seafloor has changed when eruptions occurred in the past. So there's, like I said, whole classes here at Rutgers are taught on just how we interpret cores. But this is just a very quick sampling. And this just final figure that I wanted to show you, that if you look at lots of different ice cores in Antarctica, say, you can use that and other information from scientists doing work around the world to come up with reconstructions like this. Okay, so here we have today, where this is the extent of the ice sheets. And then here's it was about 20,000 years ago. So this was during the last glacial maximums. This is the last time that the glaciers and the ice age was at its max extent. And then this is 120,000 years ago, which was the most recent time period that was very warm like it is today, and what the extent of the ice age was. So this is why we care, because we want to see what were these climatic events like in the past, and how does that compare to today? And because we want to make predictions for the future, especially if you're doing climate work. But again, cores can tell you much, much more besides just changes in climate. And that's it. So I will go to questions. Let me stop sharing. Okay. Let me go to the question sheet. Okay, so someone asked, you mentioned how rapid technological process has changed our understanding of old cores. How do you expect our knowledge on geologic cores to change in the future? That is a really hard question to answer completely. I expect that we will have more precise measurements that will allow us to be more precise in how we can interpret the event changes in the past. The other thing is that scientists are always working to develop new proxies, analyzing new elements or counting new things in the core, to try to relate them to some sort of process. So as machines that can analyze the chemical analysis get better, we'll be able to create more proxies that might give us a look into a different aspect of either climate or something in the past that, would, be able to give more detail than we knew before. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what we discover in the future, because it's always changing. And there's always new proxies and new methods of doing this that we didn't know before. Okay, so how are the ice cores reliably dated? All right, so there's the most precise way, well, there is still some error, but the way that ice cores are dated is that someone, usually a graduate student, sits in one of those freezers, like I showed you, with the ice core on a light table, and they sit there and they count the layers. So they count, okay, here's a dark, here's a light, that's 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, etc., for the entire length of the core. And then they can count back, that's how old it is, okay? But these are only for cores that are continuous. So if these are like, if you started coring at the top of a glacier and then continued coring as far down as you can. So the problem with ice cores is that ice, even though it's a solid, it is viscous and it's not completely solid. So there's only certain parts of the glaciers that you can drill. And that's usually in the center. So basically, glaciers are like big blobs of like honey or like silly putty. So in the center, it's where it's most stable, and that's where the layers will be straight. But as it gets older and pushed to the sides tend to curve up. All right. So you can't drill on the sides of a glacier because the ice layers are no longer straight. So remember we talked about the law of superposition where the oldest is on the bottom and the youngest is on the top. That doesn't apply to the sides of the glacier because it has been moved. All right, so sometimes things happen to layers in geology, in ice and in rocks too, where that law of superposition has been kind of moved around because it has been moved by some either tectonic forces or the flowing of ice. So that is why scientists really like when you find volcanic ash layers, because they can date those layers. There is still error on that. And so you get error bars of like plus or minus a couple 100,000 years or a couple of million years, which again seems like a lot to us, but in geology that is not that long of a time. So it's as precise as we can get it. So that's about all I can say for that. At what age was the oldest core you were able to date? So for my cores, the cores that I myself work on are actually pretty young. So my my cores are from like the Holocene to Pliocene. So I think the oldest cores that I've worked with go back not even, maybe 200,000 years, which is not super old. And those aren't dated. I don't have volcanic ash layers, so I can't date precisely in my layers. And I can only use radiocarbon dating back to about 50,000 years. So things that I have physically dated and used radiocarbon to get an age on were about 40 to 50,000 years old is what I've dated. But there are people in my department who work with cores that are much, much older. Will an earthquake visibly impact the composition of a core? Yes, it will. It will disrupt it, and there are actually cores where you can see faults running through, like the rock layers, or you can have sediments disrupted from like a tsunami or an earthquake, things like that. So yes, you definitely can see evidence of earthquakes in cores. Jess says, my son is working on his NOVA awards for Scouts. He would like to know how geologic cores can make the world better. First of all, good job. I'm a NOVA counselor for Scouts, so way to go. I have talked with many kids on those awards. So how can it make the world better? I mean, I love understanding things and how things are formed. So I think cores give you a glimpse of the past, something that we can't see anymore, and understanding how these layers got there, how this mountain got there, how this lake got there, how the rocks beneath our feet got there, I think is a really important thing for people to understand. And it kind of puts it into perspective, our role in this world, that we haven't been here for a very long period of time. So I don't know if that makes the world a better place, but I think it gives us a better understanding and appreciation for how long this earth has been here doing what it does, and that we're just a small part of that at this point. So I don't know if that answers it, but I think it's pretty cool. Okay, another question. How do scientists decide where to drill? Okay, so that's a really good question. You can't just go and drill anywhere. I mean, you could, but you might not get a lot of information. So first of all, it's very time intensive and it's expensive to drill cores. So you don't want to just go anywhere. And especially if you are on a ship in the middle of the ocean that is costing $1 million a day to operate, you better know where you're going to drill. So usually there are sampling or survey studies that are done that go out to the area of interest. So, you know, the geologist might have studied the land on top of the earth, if you're on land, not in the ocean, and looked at them and say, wow, I can see this here. And they use the laws of stratigraphy and they date things and they take samples and they analyze them for the proxies and say, okay, well, we figured out all of this, but now we want to see what's beneath the surface. So they might try to do imaging surveys, things like seismic surveys where you send sound waves down into the ground. And then when the sound waves come back up and hit a receiver, it makes a picture basically of what's beneath the earth, and geologists will interpret that and say, okay, I see these structures here. I think this area is a good place to drill. Same with in the ocean, you can do seismic waves seismic profiles where you take images of the seafloor and you say, okay, well, I see this here. I want to drill here, okay, because I want to get to like the deepest sediments, or I want to get a really high resolution, a lot of sediment that's like the youngest sediment. So I want to drill over here. And things like sonar and swath radar bathymetry, where they image the ocean floor, those things are all used before you drill. So scientists try to collect as much information as possible before they go and start drilling. Okay. How successful is ice core sampling? Is it common for mistakes to happen when studying the core? Yeah, mistakes happen with ice cores and regular cores. I have probably made every mistake possible studying sediment cores. I've dropped samples on the floor. I have washed my samples down the drain when I was cleaning the mud out of them. And I'm sure people who have worked with ice cores have accidentally melted their samples, and especially if things like, what if your freezer breaks and your cores melt? So yes, mistakes happen, and this is usually why we take small samples so that there's leftovers. I think it was one of the questions of archiving, so that you usually split the cores in half and you take little sections of it, or you take a little piece so that there's more that you can go back to and sample it, one, if you mess up, or two, if you need more sample. And then you have the archive so that if you always need to go back and reference it, it's there for the future as well. Okay, so next question, do you need special access to enter the Livingston core repository, or can I go visit? Yes, you would need special access. They're not open to visitors just to walk in. And right now with COVID, it's not open. But maybe at some point in the future, we could do a virtual tour, which was something we had talked about doing, showing some pictures of the tour of the cores. And possibly we might, when we have more in-person things at the museum, we might be able to bring some of the cores to the museum for people to see in the future, but unfortunately not right now. Okay, are the air bubbles captured by the ice cores more oxygen rich than the air we breathe today? I don't know the answer to that because I don't study that. I imagine it's pretty similar, but I don't know. I can't tell. I'm not even going to guess because I don't know the answer to that. So what is it like to spend time at sea? I have only done it once, but I loved it. I was at sea for a month and it was very peaceful. I loved every minute of it, despite the fact that I get seasick. I was really only seasick like one day, and then you kind of get used to it. But you spend pretty much, as the entire time you're at sea, someone is working. So usually you have a night shift and a day shift, and you're coring or taking samples the entire time. Because like I said, it costs a lot of money. You want to get as much data when you're out there as you possibly can, because you have a very limited time to collect the data. yeah, I missed my family, my friends. This was a long time ago, almost 20 years ago that I was at sea. But it's a lot of fun. I enjoyed it a lot being at sea, and I hope that I get to do that again. Um, where have I traveled for my research? So I did go to sea. We went to sea, we sailed out of Woods Hole in Massachusetts, and we were sailing off the Cape off the coast of like Cape Hatteras was the area that we were traveling, we were coring. Other places that I've been, I went to Costa Rica on a geology field trip when I was in grad school to study a bunch of the volcanoes there. I'm actually going to be going back to Costa Rica probably this summer, which I'm super excited about. Maybe next summer if COVID permits, where we're going to be using drones to study the volcanoes and some hazards for the volcanoes. I went to Switzerland for 3 weeks when I was a polar trek teacher. We did work in the Swiss Alps, again with drones, imaging the glaciers to uh, learn about them sliding down mountains. I think where else I've been. I've done a lot of work in New Jersey. All last year, I was working with Ashland, actually. We were going down to the Jersey Shore and flying drones, LBI, to study the beach erosion there. So I've done a lot of local field work as well. Um, okay, let's see. Uh, Ria's mom wants to know, can cores get damaged from pollutants or bacteria? Can there be active bacteria in ice core? Active in ice core, I don't know the answer to that. I don't think there is. I think it's too cold, especially if you're collecting from Antarctica, because, you know, in Antarctica, it's too cold even for bacteria to live. But yes, cores can be damaged. They can grow mold, they can rot, they can break, dry rot, so that you definitely have to store them properly or they will deteriorate. So that is a real problem with studying cores, which is why you want to do as much work when you first open them as documenting them as possible so that you can get that pristine look at it. So that way, if there is, you know, damage, whether it's, you know, from some kind of rotting or bacteria or mold, or if somebody drops the core and breaks it and it's no longer in its nice tube and you don't know what the top and what the bottom is, that doesn't help you anymore. So you work carefully and quickly when you first open a cores. Let's see, what made me decide to become a geologist? I don't have an exact time when I was like, I'm going to be a geologist. I already told you that when I was little, I wanted to be a paleontologist because I didn't know that geology was like a thing. But I clearly remember when I was little, in elementary and middle school, high school, learning earth science in school. So thank you to my earth science teachers growing up, that I remember learning about plate tectonics and things like that and just thinking it was so amazing and thought it was so cool how it explained so much. I just thought it was fascinating that plate tectonics, oh, that's why there's earthquakes or that's why there's volcanoes. And it just made a really big impression on me. That coupled with the fact that I used to do a lot of traveling with my parents when I was little, they would take me to all different national parks like Mount St. Helens, Yosemite, Yellowstone, all of those. And I was so fascinated by these amazing geologic features surrounding me that I wanted to know, I wanted to find out how they were formed. And that's what led me into geology. Um, And it says, shout out from Miss Wheeler. I want to give out shout out to JC Park's elementary students here today. Miss Wheeler says her students can go see her tomorrow for something special. So thank you, Miss Wheeler, for coming and for encouraging your students to come. And I think I have time for, let's see if there's one more question that I haven't answered yet. How do you date layers in a sediment core sample versus an ice core sample? So I explained a little bit of that. Some of the techniques are the same. So if you find igneous layers, so volcanic layers or igneous rock, you can use radiometric dating, so like argon, or things like that, methods like that to get like a numeric age. Okay, so it will tell you like how many millions or thousands of years old that sample is. So that is how you can, in most sediment cores, if it is older than 50,000 years old, that you can date those things. You can use certain fossils, which we call index fossils. These are fossils that we know lived within like a narrow time frame. So I don't mean like one individual lived from a time frame, but their entire species from when it first evolved to it went extinct. So if we know, for example, actually the T-Rex is a really good index fossil. So as the entire species, the T-Rex was only around for about 3 million years, which again is a lot, but in geology it isn't a whole lot. So if you find a T-Rex fossil in a rock, you know very precisely that it is between about 68 million and 65 million years old. So that's just one example of an index fossil, but there's a lot of different of those things. If you find those index fossils in cores, then that tells you, gives you an idea. It doesn't tell you exactly, but it gives you a smaller range of how old that core is. And I also said the ice cores are very unique because they're one of the only things on Earth that you can count the layers to get an actual age. So like I said, there's one layer of a dark and a light layer is 1 year. So ice cores are one thing on Earth that does it. Tree rings are the other. Fish also do that, which I did not know. That's something I learned today with the trivia. And then the last thing that does that is a type of sediment core. So this does happen in sediment cores, but this happens in lakes, which are called vars. So this is another type of sediment that you only get in very specific conditions. It happens in a certain type of lake where you get a light and a dark layer that represents 1 year. So you could count those layers back for ages. So yes, some of the techniques are the same, but some of them are different depending on what type of core that you're using. And I think I am out of time.
So that was really cool, a really cool talk. And
Thanks. I feel like I rambled, but thank you for listening.
no, it was really good. I love the pictures and yeah, I'm sure everyone will agree that was really informative. So thank you again for being our speaker tonight. And for the rest of you, thank you all for being our lovely audience. And I know I said this was our last late night event, but I did not say it's our last event of the semester. Our last event is actually going to be on December 16th at 6 p.m. And it is our Ask a Geologist, and the topic will be water sustainability. And we will be joined by Rutgers alumnus Sean Stevenson, who is a natural resource specialist at Blue Triton Brands. And Sean will be talking all about water, how it's used, and how we can help to conserve it. So I'm sure we all look forward to hearing that again on December 16th at 6 p.m. And so mark your calendars and we'll see you again. And good night, everybody. And thank you, Lauren.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.